Good evening, everyone. It's November 11, 2012. I'm Rene Ritchie, and tonight we are reviewing the iPad mini. This is the iMore Show. Joining me tonight is the co-host of Iterate, the mobile design-centric podcast, and the co-founder of Nickelfish, the awesome design studio, Mr. Seth Clifford. How are you, Seth?
I'm doing well. How are you tonight?
Good. Did I accolade you enough there? Were you sufficiently accoladed?
Oh yeah, I would say so. That's more praise than I've gotten in recent memory.
Well, no, I want to bona fide you because we're gonna talk about the iPad mini tonight, maybe a little bit the iPad 4, and I want to make sure that when you speak about it, people know that you are not just pulling this out of somebody's magical rabbit hat. You have credentials from which to speak.
Yeah, I'd like to think that after a decade wasting more time than I have a right to with mobile devices, that I've at least got a few things to add to the discussion.
You have a plethora of geekosity in your arsenal.
Yeah.
So let's get right to it. We are tonight reviewing the iPad mini, and we're going to answer a bunch of questions too. So if you have questions, you can throw them in the chat room, and we will ask specifically at the end. We've got some emails and some Twitter posts to get to as well. But the iPad mini, Seth, it was long rumored. We heard about it since almost a day after the regular iPad launched. You bought it day and date, or did you get it a little bit later?
No. Well, actually, I ordered one for the office for testing.
Okay.
And it was supposed to come day and date, but we had that whole hurricane thing, and we didn't have any power at the office, so we weren't at the office, so I couldn't have it delivered to the office, so I had to have it rerouted, so I got it a couple days later. But technically, I got it day and date.
All right, so let's start off. We'll start off with the hardware. It is technically an iPad 2, and Apple is very careful to say it is, in Johnny Ive English, it is not a reduction, it is a concentration. You think that's a fair way of assessing this device?
I think it's fair in some regards, and I think it's a little bit inaccurate in others. Okay. I think it's fair in some of the types of things that you would tend to do with it. And I don't know if we want to get into it now because it may actually, what I'm about to say may
okay, so let's break it apart. Let's start with the design. Unlike the iPad 4, which is the spitting image of the iPad 3, except for the Lightning connector, this has a radical new design. It has almost the same design as the 5th generation iPod Touch. It has Apple's latest design language, complete with the smaller, rounded, curved edges, the black or white, the Vader or Stormtrooper anodized aluminum finish, the metal buttons. It's interesting that Apple chose to give the iPad mini this design and not the big iPad.
Yeah, that's something that I am hoping we see in the future. I mean, I understand why they probably didn't, change up the design language of the larger one. I think they wanted this one to probably stand out a little bit as a new product. And with the 4th generation iPad, it seems that the internals got a huge bump, but the shell is pretty much the same. And I think until they make radical changes to the internals, be it the battery or the chipset or whatever for the next generation model, I think they're sticking with that, and that's what it's going to be. But I'm actually hoping that they carry this over. And I think they will, just because now the phones look like this and the iPad mini looks like this. Then the
one of these things is not like the others.
Right, exactly. So the new iPods have this same kind of feel. I'm looking forward to a larger iPad in this style.
Yeah, and it's especially interesting because, just like you mentioned, the iPad 4 got all the new internals, but none of the new design, where arguably this got all of the new design, but none of the new internals.
Yeah, and, we've had several discussions about this and why that is, and, keeping costs down and technological limitations for what.
Well, they didn't need it, right? Like, based on, we'll get to the Retina in a second, but based on everything they wanted for this device, they didn't need any more horsepower.
No, it's true. And the performance of the iPad mini is actually very, very commendable, considering that it's not even last gen, but like last gen guts.
It's a Daishunk F. So before I get to the Daishunk F5, the whole goal of this is that it is thinner and lighter. It's a quarter thinner than the full big boy iPad, and it's over 50% lighter than the full-sized iPad. And that seems to have been, like, you can never have everything. There's that famous thing, you can have good, you can have cheap, or you can have fast. Pick two. And the iPad is similar to that. And the things that Apple picked seems to have been thinness and lightness.
Right. And I think that at that size, those are two things that you can speak to very easily that will sell a lot of these units, because I think at that size, people are not looking at it, possibly, I know I'm not, as a productivity device. They're looking at it as a reader, a video game player, a video watcher. They're looking at all the different media types that they can enjoy at that size that will fit and be really great. And I don't think that, the kind of work that I like to do on my larger iPad really kind of translates to that smaller size. So I think the size and the weight are critical factors for the 7.9 inch.
Yes, and the other thing that's interesting is Apple went with the full-on glass and aluminum treatment, as they have done with every other iOS device. They didn't use any soft touch plastics. They didn't use any sort of material. And I find that when you're trying to hold it with one hand, because it's heavier than an iPhone or an iPod Touch, there's not as much friction, so it is a little bit harder to hold on to. With other devices, they make a point of giving you this plasticky, soft, frictiony edge to hold. But I'm coming out in favor of this design because I can add a case that makes it stickier or more frictiony or better or easier to hold on to. I can't go and add better build quality to a competing device with soft touch.
No, absolutely. I'm a huge fan of the Dodo case makes it. It's a book back. It's basically like a leather sticker, and they're ridiculously inexpensive. And if they make one, and I assume they will, since they have them for, I think, all the other iOS devices, you can just throw that on there, and you've got your texture, and you've added almost no weight to it, and you've still got you can still see the nice design. You haven't even wrapped it up in anything. So I would agree that you want to, you want to go with as little as you possibly can for the device itself, and then augment it in any way that you want. I think it's okay. I didn't really have any problem holding it. I also wasn't palming it like, an NBA player because little lady hands, but I didn't have a problem, holding it when I was using it.
I find that the iPhone and iPod Touch are definitely one-handed machines. I can hold them in one hand. My thumb can reach most of the screen. I can do a lot of things with one hand. The full-size iPad, I need two hands. I need one hand to hold it, another hand to poke around, or both hands to hold it and both thumbs to work. This is sort of a hand and a halfer to me, where I still need one hand to hold it, but that thumb can do stuff, my other hand can do stuff. It's sort of right in between.
No, absolutely. And in some ways, I think that can be a little bit awkward because you might get comfortable with it in one position, and whereas with your phone, you can kind of flip it around in your hand and adjust and do what you need to do. You might need to actually bring the other hand up or bring a knee up and kind of do it. And I mean, it sounds asinine to actually say things out loud like, oh, yeah, you've really got to consider how you're going to use your limbs to control this device. But you're right. I mean, if you're thinking of it in those terms as a one-handed or a two-handed device, it's definitely, like you said, like a hand and a half. Like the iPad, full-size iPad, definitely two hands. I mean, that thing's like a manhole cover. But this one is not quite as, let's say, nimble as your phone would be.
And I find that kind of influences how I use it. So the iPhone and iPod Touch have always been on-the-go devices. You can strap it to your arm if you want to exercise. You can use it while you're in line, while you're out, while you're doing anything. It's just always with you, always available. And it's your on-the-go productivity machine. The iPad for me has always been, you need a lap, you need a table, you need something to put it down. If I try to hold it up while I'm in bed, it's just too heavy for that. I can hold it for a while, but if I'm trying to watch like an hour TV show or 2-hour movie, it gets tiring. And I start putting it down or leaning it against things. So it's more like a lap, feet up, sofa kind of device, where the iPad mini, to me, it's in between. It's good for commuting. If you're in the passenger seat, it's great for if you're lying down. I can hold this up in bed way longer than I can hold the big iPad. And if I do fall asleep, this thing cracking my skull is going to do far less damage than a full-sized iPad. So it's not really sitting feet up, and it's not really feet down on the go. It's sort of lying down or sitting while you're moving about.
Yeah, it is. And a lot of people, I think yourself included, have been saying like, this is the iPad that I'm going to be taking everywhere. I kind of left my other one at home, but this one feels more mobile. I want to put it in a bag. I want to put it in a large jacket or whatever. And I I don't see myself doing that with something at that size. Like this size to me is like reading, in certain situations. And because of what I like to do with the iPad, I don't feel that it's even in that range of mobility for
Yeah.
me. I feel like the phone is always going to be that thing that I have with me attached to me. And then my 10-inch iPad is going to be the one that I do sit down at a table with, and I do use it a lot, lately a lot more. I think even more since I've gotten the iPad mini, I've kind of been like, well, let me go back to the big one and actually see what it is I like about it. And it's kind of made me use it even more.
No, I agree completely with that. And I have put the mini inside my jacket pocket, my blazer pocket, or my, it's getting cold in Montreal already, so inside my winter jacket pocket. It does fit in the back pocket of your skinny hipster jeans. Jim Dalrymple was kind enough to give us that ass shot on loopinsight.com. So thanks for that, Jim. And that's something you can't do. Like I famously made fun of the fact that I couldn't put the big iPad in a pocket. I had to have a bag with me or one of those cases that look like a school book or a duotang or binder or something. So it's definitely not a front pocket device. It is sort of a back pocket, jacket pocket device. And that actually is an improvement for me on the go from the regular iPad.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're the kind of person that carries like a small messenger bag or something that already has stuff in it, this is a great addition to that without really, making you feel like you're carrying a lot more. Like for a while, I was carrying my 15-inch MacBook Pro and my iPad with the Logitech keyboard, and then my phone was on me, and it was just like I don't really need all of this. And when I was going back and forth from the office with the laptop and the mini, I was like, you know what, this doesn't even feel like I have anything in here.
Yeah.
And then you can pull it out if you want it, and it's there.
Yeah, if I have a MacBook Pro and an iPad 4 in my bag, I can feel it. If I have a MacBook Air and an iPad mini in my bag, all I feel is bag.
Mm-hmm.
I put up some picture. Let's go into the Retina display now. So the traditional iPad has a 9.7-inch display. The iPad mini has a 7.9-inch display. You see what Apple did there, Seth? Are you getting it? Are you getting it there?
Yep.
They're backwards. The iPad mini starts off with the same display resolution that the original iPad and the iPad 2 have, which is 1024 by 768. It's got a better quality panel. It's got, the latest IPS panel technology in this, which means it's got great color, good contrast, great viewing angle. And Apple so they say that that's 33% less screen real estate compared to I had Leanna do all the math for this. There was no way I was getting anywhere near the math for this. So it's got 50, the big iPad has 45.2 square inches to 29.6 square inches for the iPad mini. So before we get to resolution, Seth, does the actual size of the screen change things for you?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I had written up what was going to be a blog post that I ended up just not publishing because I figured we would just talk about it here, and I got lazy and didn't feel like
Podcast for the win.
Yeah, but that even more than the Retina, that the screen size and the compression of visual elements is the deal breaker for me. I think it's not even like a snobbish, oh, it's not Retina, so I don't want it. It's that I was looking at the apps that I use, and I looked at them on the iPad mini, and some of the ones that didn't have adjustable text options are really not as good. They're not as usable on that small screen because the elements are compressed. Text is a lot smaller and it's crushed. And obviously on a non-Retina display, smaller text doesn't look as good. I'm a fan of smaller text, so even if I bump up the font sizes, I'm looking at it and I'm thinking like, well, this really isn't as usable to me on that other screen. And I think this is where it's not disingenuous, but it's a little bit kind of like there's an asterisk on it when you say like, oh, all the iPad apps work. Because if you're a developer that really tailored both, your app to an iPhone and the 10-inch iPad, you really need to take a look at how it looks on this display because Retina aside, all of the things that you may have planned for your spatial layout and everything, it's completely compressed. And it's, this is where the debate over like it's iPad concentrated or iPad shrunk down kind of gets its legs because there are ways in which the iPad is truly concentrated. Like I said earlier, the media stuff, but for me, a lot of the stuff I do on it, productivity apps and things like that, they're not as usable.
Can you give me so is this, I'll ask you to give me a couple examples in a second, but is this something that developers can fix by introducing a couple bigger size font options than they offer now? Or is this something that's just at the core of having a 44 point hit target on a device that's 163 pixels per inch as opposed to 126, whatever the other one was, 132?
I really think that it depends on the app and what people are going to do with it. So one of the ones that I noticed was App Shopper. App Shopper is an app that looks great on your phone and it looks great on the 10-inch iPad because there's little icons and little summaries and stuff like that. When you take that same display from that larger iPad and compress it on the smaller screen, all of that text that's really not adjustable just gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And I have trouble like flipping through and scanning to like grab little bits of text, like the way that I kind of browse. That's one of them that I noticed right off the bat because I look at that almost every day and just check out, what apps are updated and new and things like that. There are other apps like a Tweetbot or a NetBot where you do have selectable font sizes and you can actually bump them up and down. But again, for me, I'm used to seeing things at a certain size, and when I'm flipping through something like a timeline, my eyes are looking for certain words to like kind of hang on, and if I can't parse that text the same way, just because there's more of it in the space that I'm usually looking, it's harder for me to actually feel like I'm using the app and like like appreciating it and getting the information out of it.
But is that because App Shopper made it smaller than quote unquote the HIG would recommend for the big iPad, and now they're suffering for it on the iPad mini? Or is that they did what they were supposed to do on the iPad and Apple is now forcing it too small?
Well, we're just talking about text for this particular example.
So, for example, like Tweetbot, I'm using an iPad mini, not a problem in the world. And that had, the text size is fine for me. I'm using iBooks, the text size is fine for me.
I think that it probably worked on the 10-inch iPad if it was the kind of thing where they were just shy of, running afoul of the HIG.
Okay.
They did it in a way on the larger iPad that really didn't matter because they had the screen space to get away with it. I think now with the smaller screen, that kind of trade-off, if there even is one, like I don't know the guys who developed it, so I couldn't speak for them. But if that was the case, this would be an example of you kind of fell out on the good side on the larger one, but now you have to go back and look at it. And I mean, this would really be solved in a lot of cases with an adjustable font size within the app, but that's not how it was developed. So now people have to go back and think about it. The other side of this is either developers do things like that and build in controls for that, or we enter, kind of a phase of device detection where we're looking for the device hardware that you're running on and serving up different assets based on that. And I don't think people really want to do that because the whole idea is, hey, guess what? It's just like an iPad 2, but a little smaller. All the apps work, all your touch targets, etc. That's where I think the tricky part comes in. Like, do you adjust like kind of in line with the app and just say, okay, well, we've got to treat this differently and give people some control over the display and the fonts? Or do you actually say, well, if it's an iPad mini, we're going to put code in that actually says that and serves up different stuff?
Yeah, and that's, that may or may not be trivial. I'm sure you could detect for this device, but you'd have to do a little bit of magic because the iPad 2 is probably presenting a lot of the same specs as the iPad mini.
Right. And I think that's what makes it really tricky is that I think to a lot of applications, this is going to look like an iPad 2. So it's not just like, oh, flip the mini switch and we've got, slightly larger fonts.
So let's go into the Retina elephant in the room. The iPad mini is the first non-Retina display device that Apple has released since the iPad 2. Even the MacBook Pros have gone Retina at the high end now. The iPad mini, my understanding is that it is currently beyond the laws of physics and economics for there to be a Retina display in the iPad mini. And even Apple, as wealthy and powerful and smart as they are still bound by the laws of physics. And if you put 2048 by 1536 pixels into this display, you would have to add more LED to light it. You'd have to add more battery to power it. And you'd essentially have to have a device that is as thick and maybe close to as heavy as an iPad 4 and likely close to almost as expensive as an iPad 4. And you've already got the iPad 4. So Apple was forced to put in a lower resolution display. And some people have said, well, that's not really true because the iPhone 5 and the iPad 5, the iPhone 4, all the iPhones and iPod Touches have Retina displays. So why can't they do the iPad mini? But it turns out if you actually look at the pixel counts, the pixel count for an iPhone and an iPod Touch is close to the pixel count of an iPad without a Retina display. So Retina iPhone is equivalent to a non-Retina iPad. If you go to a Retina iPad, you are blowing the roof through the pixel count. And again, we did the math, and you have 7,860, I'm getting one of them wrong. 786,000 pixels on an iPad, non-Retina, 727,000 pixels on an iPhone 5, and a Retina iPad Mini would be 3,145,000, which is a substantially higher load. And the whole reason you have an X processor, an A5X or an A6X, is to power all that. So you'd have to stick that into an iPad Mini as well. So it's absolutely not feasible yet. Might be in the future. Again, Apple seems to have been willing to throw out Retina display, which they have held near and dear for years, Seth, just to get to lighter and thinner.
Yeah, and it's a choice that I think a lot of people, when they heard about it, were basically holding out hope that the screen would be as good as they needed it to be. And I think in a lot of cases that turned out to be true. You've said that, non-Retina stuff makes you crazy, but
yeah.
Pretty quick, you've adjusted, you're enjoying using it, right?
It bothers me, but it's like, if you're in love with somebody and there's just one annoying personality trait, you kind of start looking at them as a whole person and not as a series of check marks. And that's sort of what it is with the iPad Mini. It's so easy to hold. It's so this that I'm willing to put up with a sandpaper on my eyeballs.
Mm-hmm. And see, for me, I think that for the things that I do primarily on the iPad, I don't really want to. I feel like I'm taking a step back if I get a non-Retina device. And because of the way I use the iPad, the whole portability aspect, as I said earlier, doesn't really kind of fit for me. So it's the kind of thing that I've looked at and said, well, I've held it in my hand. It's lovely. It's very light. It's almost, magical in the fact that it exists the way that when you held the iPhone 5 for the first time, it felt like a dummy display unit.
Yes, it was not real.
Right. It really is that light. But I don't think that I want to take that step back to non-Retina, especially given that what I'd be doing at that size is not the kind of stuff that I'd be doing on the larger iPad, and it would stand out to me more.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that different people have a different reaction. Both my sister and my mother have iPad 2s. They've rarely, if ever, used an iPad 3 or an iPad 4, maybe just to look at. And yeah, they liked it better, but every day they use an iPad 2. So for them, both of them thought the iPad Mini actually looked better than the iPad 2 because it is denser. It's 163 pixels as opposed to 132 whatever pixels per inch. So it's a slight improvement. My little 4-year-old godson picked it up and said, "Oh, look, an iPad my size." And that's the only thing he wants to use now. After I'd let him play games on the big iPad, he just wants the iPad Mini now. So there's going to be a bunch of people who don't care about this, but there will be people like you and I who, once you use a Retina display, it really is tough to go back to a non-Retina display. They've got to put on a heck of a dress to make me not look at the Retina.
Yeah, and even still, even if this had a Retina display, I think I'd enjoy using it a little bit more, but it still is not fitting into any spot where I need it to be. At that size, I have a Kindle for the reading that I would do.
And what?
Yeah, just come on.
Never heard of it.
Don't be like that.
Never heard of it.
The reason I use my iPad is very different than the reason I read on a Kindle. So I don't see an iPad at this size replacing a larger one for me and doing the things that I can do on it. So I think it's more about finding a place in my life to use this kind of thing, and maybe that means going off the deep end and installing them into the walls of my home and
in your car dashboard.
Yeah, and being that guy. But for right now, I feel like my needs are met, so I'm kind of just waiting to see what happens.
If you go to our review, I did a series of diagrams that show the different physical pixel counts and the different physical sizes of the devices. And I also took some macro photos so you can see what icons and graphics and fonts look like. And I find the difference most noticeable on small fonts because they are of less resolution. They do look blurrier and they are a little bit harder to read. So if you do have a lot of small fonts on things, I think that's where it's mostly noticeable. But again, it bothered me a lot at first, and now my usage is very different, and maybe we can get to that later, but the things I do on an iPad Mini are different than the things I do on an iPad. And I think that there are certain things like video and games that are a lot more forgiving of low resolution than things like text and line work. I think your usage pattern varies too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, stuff like magazines and games and video looks fantastic on this device. Books for me did not really hold up as well because I really was looking at, the edges and seeing that kind of blurriness and just feeling like this isn't right. But
non-crisp serifs.
But what's strange is that the things that really stuck out to me as more egregious than the Retina screen itself were elements within the OS itself that I feel should have been different. Like when a notification banner comes down from the top, it looks comically small on Retina iPad, but on the iPad mini, not only is it small, but like that text is so tiny in that banner, it's almost impossible to read. And I know people are going to
Yeah.
say, it's not possible. You can read. Yeah, I get that. I'm
He's not
using
talking about that. He's just saying it's hard.
hyperbole to make a point.
Yes.
Really, really hard. Things like in Facebook, when you tap on something and you get a little popover with like, the notifications in it, those are really small too. It's really hard to see that stuff. And so there are elements that you kind of come across within the OS itself. I know Facebook's not part of the OS, but it's really, really common on
it. May as well be.
Exactly. There are things like that I look at and go, wow, that banner is like that. It's tiny. I can barely see what that notification is. And those are the things that I do see a lot and I do notice. And those would stick out a lot.
Yeah, so I think that's an absolutely valid point. And I think that where Apple has strayed from best practices, for example, some of the buttons in Calendar are very small, some of the text in Notification Center are very small. I think there'll be a group of people, maybe especially people who have vision-specific issues, might be better with the full-size iPad just because of the size. But I'm going to move us along to performance. The iPad Mini has an Apple A5 processor. It's the same processor as the new iPad 2, which is the die shrunk. I believe it's a 35 nanometer version of the Apple A5, not the original one, but the one that came the year later. It's also used now in the iPod Touch because it does not have to drive a Retina display. It is not an X processor. It's not an A5X or an A6X like the big boy iPad. And we did a bunch of Geekbench tests. And it's amazing how consistent things were. We tested the iPad Mini against the iPad 2, iPad 3, and iPad 4. The iPad Mini was 751 on Geekbench. The iPad 2 was 758. The iPad 3 was 757. You can see what big a hit the Retina display puts on that processor. And now the double fast iPad 4 is 1759. It's a monster, but it's not perceptively that different. Mostly it just makes everything, it doesn't speed up the device, but it reduces the amount of lag, if that makes any sense. Like you don't get the stuttering as much. The Mini is surprisingly quick. When you pick it up and you play with it, I think the first thing you notice, in addition to, wow, this is an interesting small screen with iPad apps on it, is it's very snappy. Yeah. Like it's been optimized and conditioned to run, that hardware runs the software exceptionally well. So you are not waiting for anything. That said, I don't feel like I'm waiting for anything with my third generation iPad. No.
And I use it like an animal, like jumping back and forth between apps and doing stuff and copying huge blocks of text, into a text app and into something else. I do a lot with it, and I don't feel it lagging ever.
But I do feel like it's almost like the Retina MacBook Pros, that it's at the very edge of what, like, that processor is doing everything it has to, and it does get a little, I'm not going to call it hot, it gets a little warm if you're doing a lot of gaming. So and the iPad 4 is not as cool as the iPad 2 or iPad Mini, but it's much less warm than the iPad 3. So I think you're right. I think the iPad 3 is fine. It's just hauling ass to be fine, where the iPad Mini feels like it's comfortably fine.
Right. The iPad Mini makes it look easy, and the third generation iPad definitely does the same stuff, but you can see that little bead of sweat coming down its forehead because it's just trying to keep its cool, but it just can't.
Retina is heavy. Every time Apple puts a Retina display in a device, the first generation device takes a hit. The iPhone 4, you could feel that was constrained more than the iPhone 4S was. The iPad 3 was constrained more than the iPad 4 was. Retina takes a hit. The Retina MacBook Pros, that thing is burning that processor as fast as it can, and the next generation will no doubt be better. So Retina display free, Apple gets a lot of performance out of much cheaper, much thinner, much cooler parts. And I think, again, that was a trade-off they were making.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was the right trade-off to make, too, because for a million reasons, not the least of which is both performance but price. I think that they looked at what they could do in the price range in which they wanted to sit, and they did pretty well. And it's a little bit more than the other tablets of its size and ilk, but I think people look at it and go, there's I've already got all these iPad apps, or I know of all these iPad apps I want to get, and I think it makes a very compelling case, regardless of the couple of bucks more that it is.
No, I agree absolutely with that. The one thing that makes a huge difference, this is a good time to talk about it, for me in my specific use case is there's no iPad mini with cellular available yet. If there was, I would have gotten that one without even thinking about it. Every iPad I've ever had has had cellular, and since they've been able to tether, I've been tethering with them. That's almost one of their primary functions. The iPad 3 can go almost 24 hours tethering to LTE, which is phenomenal. I don't like tethering to my phone because I need a phone that I don't want a battery hit on my phone. I want my phone to be always ready, always available. I'd much rather have the iPad for that, and I miss it. I still have a Nexus 7, and I stopped using it because I would take it out, not even thinking about it, and it would be dead. I'd have to tether it to my phone, and it would annoy me. And now they're putting out a Nexus 7 with cellular, and I would have gotten that one if I could back then, but I couldn't. And the same thing with the iPad Mini. The non-cellular version, I've gone out twice now and just been stuck at a stupid Starbucks because I didn't have any data. And yes, I can use their Wi-Fi and whatever, but I like having my data on my device.
Absolutely. You might recall that when the iPad 3 came out, I pre-ordered a Wi-Fi one, not really thinking, because I was like, I'll be okay. I can tether to my phone. And within, I think, a day of having it, I was talking to you, and I was like, I need the LTE.
Yeah.
I need to have it. And once I got it, I mean, that thing is a beast. It is absolutely probably one of the best devices I've ever owned, because the LTE is so fast, and I mean, it's still fast now. Like, that hasn't worn off on me. Like, oh, it's LTE, and I've gotten used to it. It's still so fast, and I tethered to it when we had no power. I was using that primarily as a laptop, but then occasionally turning on my laptop to do stuff and tethering to it, and like the battery didn't even move.
Yeah.
For like 3 or 4 hours that I was using it. It's just unbelievable. It's a fantastic device.
I have pulled over on several occasions the side of a road and quickly done a blog post or quickly edited something just on my iPad, just with LTE. I've gotten 50 down at coffee shops, and not every coffee shop has LTE, and I don't always want to be on someone else's network that I have no idea how secure it is. And it's just, that has become a deal breaker for me. I just have to have the LTE version of something now.
No, I know. I had my iPad 1 was a 3G model. I had a Wi-Fi first, traded up for a 3G, skipped the iPad 2, and then did the same thing with the iPad 3, got a Wi-Fi, and immediately swapped it out for a cellular one. I like you, I will be doing that from now on. I would not get one without it, because it is so crazy useful when you have it. And you're right. Like, yeah, you could tether your phone, you could hop on Wi-Fi, but having it built into the device and having those plans be so easily added, dropped, modified, whatever, it's total win, the whole thing, all the way down.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is so fast now that it's a little bit dangerous, because I was watching Arrow on my iPad, my big boy iPad 3, and I didn't notice that it was on LTE because there was no degradation or slowdown on video quality. And I watched an hour's worth of video on the CTV app on my iPad 3 before I realized it. So you do have to be careful with that. With great power comes great responsibility, but I would rather have that power and that responsibility than otherwise.
Absolutely.
So yeah, when that one is available, I will absolutely switch that. But that brings me to my use case, because I tether so much, and because of work, the way some of the systems that I have to access at work require OpenVPN, and there's no way to do that on an iPad yet. You can't have a persistent VPN connection running in the background all the time. It times out. The kind of VPN we use, at least, times out. It requires an app. So I need to have my laptop with me, even if it's a MacBook Air. And carrying a MacBook Air and a full-size iPad is kind of redundant. When I leave home without my laptop, I'm really happy to have the full-size iPad because I can do a lot of work on it. But if I have my Air, I am much more likely now to take an iPad mini with me. So I think that's going to be my combination. Either big boy iPad as a light laptop replacement, almost like a netbook, or a MacBook with an iPad mini, so that the MacBook is the work and the iPad mini is me, screwing around while I'm working.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of people are gonna do. People that already have an Air. I don't have an Air. I have a full size 15-inch non-Retina MacBook Pro. That's what we roll out in the office, and that's what we've got. And it's one of the latest models, so it's really fast and really good. But it's heavy, and so I don't really take my iPad with me. I usually leave it home, and then if I go away for a weekend or something, and I know I'm not going to work, I definitely take that in my phone. But I think if I had an Air, I would definitely be in a similar position as you, and I think a lot of people are going to do that. I think it's a great combination because I would definitely bust out the Air to do work without a doubt, and then you've got the iPad for everything else. I mean, even if you wanted to sit down and set it up as a secondary display for like Twitter or something, it's like a nice little mobile edition.
Yeah, I just want it to be my palette, Seth. My palette for everything. I just want to be able to pick it up, have it as my Photoshop palette, my anything that has a palette control on anywhere. I'd like it to be on my iPad Mini.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just do that, Apple. Do that, Adobe. Figure that out. The cameras, iSight and FaceTime HD cameras. The iPad 4 and the iPad Mini finally get rid of the embarrassing subpar VGA FaceTime camera and give you a 1.3 megapixel 720p FaceTime camera. And yes, most people aren't going to be out there shooting with the front-facing camera on any device. But even if you're doing, a profile pic for a social network, if you're doing a FaceTime call with your family, if you're doing a Skype chat with coworkers, it is a much improved camera. And I'm thrilled that Apple has finally put something that doesn't humiliate me on that device.
All right, so here's a question. When people take pictures with this iPad, is it acceptable or still beating worthy?
So, with the front-facing camera is so much better than any previous iPad, except for the iPad 4, that it's not even funny. I put some pictures up in the iPad 4 review, and from low light to just the sheer size difference, it's night and day. So front-facing camera, huge improvement. The iSight camera it looks to be on paper at least, and Leanna is doing a bunch of photo tests. She's put some up already. It looks to be the same 5 megapixel shooter that is in the iPod Touch and in the iPad 4. It's not 8 megapixels like the iPhone. It's just too thin. Of cameras like thickness for their glass, so it's too thin to be the iPhone 5 camera, but it's roughly equivalent to the iPhone 4 camera with better optics. And it's not it's still quasi embarrassing to be out there with an iPad taking photos. You kind of think the guy should pull the hood over his head like the old-fashioned photos and extend the little control out, but it's much better. And I've seen more and more people, especially, I don't want to say older people, but more mainstream people who maybe don't have a good camera phone, but they have their iPad with them in their bag, just take it out and shoot stuff. And I think that if I'll put the link to Leanna's photos in the show notes, but it's a really decent camera now.
Well, that's good. I mean, the only thing I've ever used my iPad camera for, and what it's actually fantastic for, is if you have an app like Scanner Pro and scanning like a full sheet of paper, it's so much easier to do like quick visual scans like that because you can see the entire sheet lined up in that giant display. So I actually use the camera for that a lot, but I've never held that stupid thing up and said like, "Hey," and taken a picture. And
when your daughter starts working, starts walking, if you only have your iPad with you and she starts, running across the garden, you are going to be taking photos and video with your iPad.
That's a very different thing than attending a public concert and holding it up on stage.
That guy.
Mm-hmm.
So the cameras are better. Another first for an iOS device, the iPad Mini actually has real, honest-to-goodness stereo speakers. There is a speaker on each side of the Lightning port at the bottom. Now, this is interesting. You can't really have stereo sound on something this small, and because you hold it landscape for most things that actually play sound, it's on one side of your head, so it's not giving you stereo. But if you've ever held an iPad or an iPhone, realized you were covering the speaker and had to turn it around, now your odds of covering the speaker are much less. Unless you have ginormous Wreck-'em Ralph hands, you are most likely going to have a clear channel of audio no matter how you're holding this device.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody's going to complain that there are stereo speakers. You'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who's like, "The hell with that, I not mono." But, it's worth pointing out that, like, to create a real stereo field, the speakers have to be far enough away from each of your ears so that the sound channels will deliver what they're supposed to. But, what are you going to do? Yeah, it's a tiny thing. The speakers are better. If you're going to complain about it, I think you probably have bigger issues to think about in your life.
But they're not necessarily better speakers. I mean, they're not particularly loud, and I understand. Georgia especially has always complained about the lack of good loudspeakers on an iPhone because she does a lot of hands-free conference calling, and often in traffic, it's it's not quite loud enough. It's just annoyingly not quite loud enough. And you'd think a tablet wouldn't be as big a deal. But if you have the family around and you're doing the FaceTime call to the grandparents or to the relatives far away, and the kids are running around and the TV or the radio, you need it to be loud enough that you can hear it comfortably in a social situation when you're actually using FaceTime or something. And it's still not there yet. I hope Apple puts as much attention into their speakers eventually as they're putting into their optics.
I think probably that'll happen at some point because they're gonna need to focus on other things. Like the camera will always get a little bit better and it'll get a little bit faster, but I think at some point they're gonna say like, hey, let's double down on music now and let's go back to that and make these things really fantastic. I think the speakers in the full size iPad are fine. Like if I really crank them up, they're plenty loud, but I'm not doing things like FaceTime calls and stuff like that with that. I would usually do that on my phone. So I don't know if I can agree with or not agree with, but I don't know if I would be the person to
It
speak
doesn't
about.
bug you that much.
No, it doesn't. It really doesn't. It's plenty for me. But Georgia definitely has a bone to pick with the speaker.
So the Lightning connector, this is now almost entirely across every 2012 iOS device now has a Lightning connector. The iPad 4, the iPad Mini, the iPhone 5, the iPod Touch 5, Lightning, 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 Lightning. Um, I don't, we've reviewed it 3 or 4 times already. I don't think there's that much more to say. It does help make lighter, thinner, sorry, not lighter. It helps make thinner devices because you don't need the old 30 pin, but it does kind of screw with your past accessories. So if you had a lot of stuff, you're going to have to either get new stuff or get adapters. And that sucks, but at some point, that's the future.
Yeah, and we've had the 30 pin connector for what, a decade. So it had to change at some point. When you look at that thing compared to the Lightning adapter, it's a ridiculous, overwhelmingly large thing that
Yes.
I can't even believe it lasted as long as
It's
it
a
did.
blunderbuss
I feel like Steve Jobs must have looked at that thing
every day.
times and been like, "This is an ungainly piece of crap that has to die," and
Yes.
it finally has.
We don't need it as much anymore either. And we've spoken about this before, but you've got AirPlay now, you've got Wi-Fi sync, you've got Bluetooth 4.0, you've got so many technologies, AirPrint that lets you do things wirelessly, but you still need to charge, and Apple has shown no interest in wireless charging, and you still need to move large media files around, and sometimes you have to move lots of them. So for those situations, or for developers putting on betas, testing things, doing development, you need a physical hardline. And Lightning has many, many advantages over the dock. Apple did introduce some more adapters this time. Originally with the iPhone 5, they only had 30-pin to Lightning adapters, both dongle and with a short cable. But now they have HDMI, VGA, SD card, and non-powered USB, Seth.
Yeah, I have a camera connection kit that I've used one time, and I wish I had more uses for them. I love the fact that all these things exist, but I don't feel the need to ever have them. Like there was a time when you
There's no projector in the Nickelfish conference room?
no, there isn't. We have a bunch
Oh.
of LCD screens. We might be getting a projector, but that's a whole different story. Um, there was a time when you could plug all kinds of USB things into that USB controller, and some of them worked and some of them didn't with varying degrees of success. But I think that's kind of over now, right? You can't
Some
really.
microphones still work. Some non-powered microphones for calls and podcasting and stuff still work.
So yeah, I mean, if you're shooting a lot of, let's say you're shooting, well, okay, perfect example. If you have a DSLR that you're shooting, and you have an SD card that you want to pop out, you can very easily preview, dump pictures onto your iPad, things like that. I mean, that I've done that, and it's a great use case for it. It's like a little kind of preview screen, and you can store stuff there. And I guess if you're on Wi-Fi, you can even throw them right into your photo stream.
No, absolutely. And the one thing to note, some people have said that card readers don't work in the USB, which means that if you have an older, larger card, I think they're called CF cards on your DSLR, you might not have a good solution. But we're gonna look into that. Battery life is kind of too easy to tell. It feels to me like the iPad 2, where it gets the same battery life. They always say 10 hours of battery life. iPad 1, 2, 3, 4. but the iPad 2 just seems so effortless about its battery life. The iPad 3 lasts as long, but it seems to me that it's a harder job for it to do it. And the iPad mini just, I mean, I don't think I've charged it since I bought it. It's been a week and I've been using it a lot and it's nowhere near done. And
Yeah.
compared to the Nexus 7, the standby life is just dreamy. My Nexus 7, if I don't use it, might as well put it on to charge anyway. With the iPad mini, it just lasts.
No, I know. That's one of the things I like the best about the iPad is that the battery just goes and goes and goes, and the mini battery and the way that it is optimized with the software, and it's obviously not driving that display. It lasts forever. It's crazy. You barely have to charge it.
All right, so we're going to get to apps and accessories in a minute, but we're just going to spend a couple seconds talking about the interface because when Apple announced the iPad mini, they actually had a Nexus 7 up on stage. And part of Apple's value prop for the iPad mini is part of how they set it up as being more expensive than a Nexus 7 or an Amazon Kindle was that it was bigger. Never mind screen density, it was physically bigger. 7.9 inches and 4:3 aspect ratio is just gives you more usable surface than a 7-inch screen that is in 16:10 or 16:9. And I am not eager to believe people, so I put it to the test. And again, Leanna ran the math, but we did a bunch of diagrams, and it actually does work out to 29.6 square inches versus 21.9 square inches. And because of the way that, because the iPad mini has the traditional iPad interface, it actually has a lot more usable part of the display for apps. Um, Other devices, for example, the Nexus 7 has the menu bar across the bottom persistently, which means those pixels are always denied the application. When you go vertically, because the height is much less in 16:10, you get much less content displayed. Like it's wider content, but it's higher. It's not as high, which is the same thing on a laptop if you have a very small laptop. So that statement turned out to be true. The other thing that turned out to be true, and this maybe is more in your wheelhouse, Seth, whereas that maybe is exactly in your wheelhouse, is Apple is running tablet software, multi-column, multi-panel tablet software on the iPad mini. And I did some side-by-side tests with the Nexus 7. And the Nexus 7 quite often defaults to smartphone software. It's got a hybrid UI. And it's just not as informationally dense. It doesn't make good use of the size. And Apple is providing what Steve Jobs said, a better class of software so far on tablets.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I the Nexus 7 is a cool device, and I when the first 7-inch tablets came out, I really was kind of down on them because I just thought it's ridiculous. It's really just too small. When I started to use them, I realized there was a place for something of that size, and obviously, the iPad Mini is really showing that a lot, and it's going to sell as such. But the difference, as you said, is that a lot of those 7-inch tablets either aren't detecting tablet apps the way that they're supposed to, or they're just not running tablet apps. A lot
Or
of
the
them for a while.
developer hasn't made an interface for tablets.
Exactly. And a lot of them were running, Gingerbread for a long time, and that did not support tablet stuff at all. That was a phone OS, and that's what the original Kindle Fire ran was, a modified Gingerbread. So you're right in that when you do have multi-column tablet apps, you are actually using that space more. The trade-off is, of course, everything's a little bit smaller, but I would much rather have things a little bit smaller and see more of what I want, more content, more controls, more of all that stuff, than have a really, really sparse, stretched, kind of wide display that does not show me much of anything. And in that case, maybe the font isn't even customizable and
Yeah.
it's built for a phone screen. So now it looks completely preposterous on a larger screen.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, the Nexus 7 has a lot, like Google Now, way better than Siri. Google Apps, they have intents, they have a lot of power and flexibility. You can customize it way more than iOS. But just as a mainstream tablet device, like Ryan Block said, the Kindle Fire is more of a media consumption device. It's not a computing appliance, it's a media appliance. Nexus 7 is a little bit small. To me, it's more of an iPod Touch. If you want an iPod Touch rather than an iPad mini, the Nexus 7 is like a bigger iPod Touch, so it might be a better choice. But if you actually want a smaller tablet, I think the iPad mini is a much better choice than any 7-inch tablet. With the only exception maybe that the Backbay Playbook is only $150 right now. And at that price, it's a good tablet for that money. It's last year's tech, but for $150, if you're going for cheap, that's the cheapest option.
For me, it's always about the software, though. Like, if I can't get what I want and run it on there, that $150 might as well just be set on fire.
The other advantage that I started pointing this out in my reviews because I found that a lot of people just didn't consider it and it would come back and bite them. But when you buy any iOS device and you get it from the Apple Store, you have a lot of advantages. And I always use this example. My iPhone 4S got hit by fireworks. It got destroyed by fire. Like the screen just turned into sandpaper. And I walked into the Apple Store. They gave me a very stern lecture about taking better care of my products, and they replaced it for me for free. I put in my iCloud credentials. It downloaded everything right there on the fast Wi-Fi in the store, and I walked out with what was essentially, in every way, my phone. And no one else is really doing that to the level that Apple is doing yet. So if you're a kind of person for whom support, they will set it up for you. They will teach you how to use it. They will give you free classes there. That is absolutely a feature. And if it's important to you, it's something to consider when you're choosing what to buy.
Yeah, that's something that people kind of forget about too. Like there's so much competition on price and specs and even at the software level, which apps are on it and which apps aren't. But that that side, that support for a lot of people, that's the make or break point. I
Yeah.
mean, you've got family members or friends or people who are not mega nerds like you are
Mhm.
and not spend their whole day figuring things out or just don't or won't that trip to the Apple Store for them leaves them not only getting what they need accomplished, but they feel confident walking out that like, oh, I understand what this is. I know
Yeah.
I can use it.
They're
Whereas,
empowered.
yeah, like I'm sure there are carrier reps at Verizon and AT&T that will maybe on a slow day take the time and walk you through stuff, but that's not like their thing. So
And that's if you're
you,
lucky, because most carriers don't have a wide selection of tablets. You're looking at Best Buy, Radio Shack, some place where they're much more likely to be throwing your iPad around in the back of the store than actually teaching you how to use it.
yeah, and my experience with those other kind of like retail places and people asking if they can help me is it's just it's silly. I mean, they're going through the motions, but they're
Yeah.
not helpful the way people at Apple are.
Um, App compatibility. The iPad mini is 100% binary and interface compatible with all of the 275,000 tablet optimized apps on the App Store, and it will run most of the 750 plus thousand apps, including those, which includes the 275,000 apps, but also the iPhone and iPod Touch apps in double chunky fuzzy format if you really want to do it. So if you have a big investment in iOS apps, an iPad Mini they'll just work basically.
How do phone apps look like on it? I don't think I even tried.
They're a 3.5 screen and they're not Retina. They're just I mean they look as bad as you'd imagine they did from the iPad 2 days.
Yeah, that's too bad.
Well, Apple does it to incentivize people to make proper iPad interfaces. It's like the same reason the Mac didn't have arrow keys in the beginning, so you didn't port your command line tools over.
Yeah.
We suffer because Apple wants to punish bad developers. Accessories. The iPad mini is not going to fit in the cases from your previous iPad. It is a completely different form factor. If you had a backpack or pouch, you are good to go. But anything else, you will require new accessories, cables, stuff like that. Anything lightning will work. I got the smart cover. I do not like the smart cases because I find their magnet is not strong enough. There isn't one for the iPad mini yet anyway, but I don't like them in general. I have become quite a fan of the smart covers, though, especially for just around the house kind of thing.
I have a smart cover for the 3 and I like it, but ever since I got the Logitech ultra thin case, I can't go back to it. If you don't need a physical keyboard though, and obviously it's with the mini we're talking
Maybe a
about.
tiny physical keyboard.
Hey, I tried it. I actually put it in the slot and tried it, and it works. It pairs and stuff. It looks kind of funny when you close it though, because so much of the keyboard sticks out around it. But anyway, um, I'm not as much of a fan of the smart cover on the Mini though. Justin had one. He got his smart cover early, but he ordered an LTE model, so
Yeah.
he had not the iPad. So we put it on the Wi-Fi model, and I was looking at it, and it doesn't feel like it's as secure as the larger one. The larger one, I know it locks around the side, and this one does it sit
It
on?
feels more secure to me. It doesn't have the metal hinge. It's Sock Rawl in the chat room is saying there's no black one, there's no leather ones, which bug me too. But the actual connection seems a little more solid to me than the big boy iPad cover.
All right, maybe I'm misspeaking. The connection might not be my issue. when you wrap it around, it feels bulkier to me though.
Yeah.
Like feels like there's no good place to put it. Whereas with the larger one, I felt like I could kind of like either fold it up and kind of keep it in one hand, or fold it flat and it would kind of bend around. This one feels a little different to me.
Jessica is saying that it's only 3 folds and not 4, so it's not as good for landscape typing. It's too floppy, and that is also true.
That's a good point.
Now, there probably will not be as many accessories immediately for the iPad mini because the iPad 4 is the same form factor as the iPad 3, so all those accessories are good to go. They'll have to tweak for the lightning cable at most, but they are good to go. The iPad mini is going to require all new accessories, so there will be some cases. Um, some people really love the big OtterBox cases. Some people like, like the Defender series. If you want to give it to a child and really protect it. I've never been a fan of the big bulky cases. I find it kind of takes away from the thinness and lightness that makes the device so attractive.
Yeah, I think if I was working on a construction site or something, I'd feel differently, but I agree. I used to get the thinnest cases I could get just because I wanted some kind of texture on the phone. So I was a big fan of the Incipio feather cases for a while. But I've since gone naked with all of my
Yeah.
devices, and once I got over the kind of neurotic need to shield the device and realize that it's going to be okay, I really like having them just the way they are, and I think it's a different kind of use when you're not looking at and feeling a case or a cover or something like that. It really it's different.
Now, some of the things that I do like, I do like the Dodo case and the, oh, Lord help me, I'm blanking. What's the other one that, oh, I'm going to get yelled at now for forgetting the name. The one that is like a Dodo case.
Oh, pad and quill.
Yeah, Pad and Quill. I like those quite a lot. I actually like the Pad and Quill ones better right now because they have more options. Like they have, you can fold it around, put it up in different positions, and I think those. If I'm just going out with my iPad and I don't want to take a bag, I will use one of those cases because it'll protect it and I can carry it like a book and it's nice and grippy.
Mhm.
And I just like those for that kind of travel. I also like cases that have stands or that have holders for styluses, things that add utility. I don't really need the protection as much, but I do like the extra utility. I do know that people who are parents actually do like the large protective cases because kids will drop those things.
Oh yeah, absolutely. As soon as our girl is big enough to hold these things, it's going in a big old fatty case.
Yeah, she'll have her own, and it'll be my Trio 650 was actually in those armor metal cases. If you remember those, they closed completely because those things were so expensive and so hard to repair that I actually put it in paladin armor.
Yeah, yeah, I remember those. Those were serious.
All right, so pricing. This was actually kind of controversial. We originally heard that there would be an 8 GB version available for about $100 cheaper than what this one was released at, and it turned out that Apple did not release that SKU. They went straight to 16 gigabytes. My guess is when the next iPad mini, or almost certainly when the iPad mini Retina comes out, that will go to the starting at 329 slot, and the current or whatever the current generation, the previous generation iPad mini will drop down $100 and be to that what the iPad 2 is now, or what the iPhone 4 or 4S is now, or the old iPod Touch. I think Apple will seal up that umbrella with older devices, not necessarily cheaper ones. Because there's two famous sayings that Apple doesn't want to go for profit over market share, but they don't want to make crap at the same time. And I think that's how they reconcile those two positions.
Yeah, and a lot of people are looking at the introduction of this device the way that they looked at the introduction of the iPod Mini, in that it was, on the surface, not as good and cost more for what you were getting, and it ended up being the largest selling device they ever had at that
Yeah.
time. So I think they're looking at that and saying we're going to create a new class of device. This is how much it is. You're paying for a different device. Don't look at it as you're getting less or you're getting more.
Apple has never really catered to, like, if money is your absolute top concern, Apple has never catered to you as a customer. They didn't do netbooks when netbooks were cheaper than laptops, and that was great for them because most of the netbook makers are now very unprofitable, and Apple is as profitable as companies that have oligopoly control over fossil fuel resources. Apple didn't make a cheap phone. They didn't make a cheap anything. They They famously said they don't want to make a product that makes you feel good when you buy it, but terrible, a week or a month later. They want a device that you enjoy. So they're making a premium product. They are going for value over cost. And this is aluminum, it's glass, it's got a lot of fantastic technology in it, an A5 processor, dual band Wi-Fi that we didn't talk about that, but the Wi-Fi will actually grab 2 channels if it can, so it goes up to 150 megabits per second if it's available. There is a lot of very good technology in it. It still might be too expensive for some people, but it's absolutely worth the price that Apple is selling it for.
It's really like if you're on the fence and you either don't have an iPad or you really don't like the larger one, you're getting your money's worth with this device. Like you won't buy it and feel like, oh, this is kind of a cheaper, less great
Yeah,
iPad. The screen isn't that nice. Like you will pick it up and realize that it is worth the money. But that's the thing. Like, people are gonna look at it and say, well, for a little bit more, I could get the big one with the nicer screen. And you have to decide what your use cases are, but this is by no means like, a cheaper, less stellar device.
so Seth, I'm going to put you on the spot for a minute. When would you recommend an iPad mini to someone, and when would you recommend an iPad 4?
I think for so this is I think if you use your iPad or you anticipate using your iPad for anything more than quote unquote consumption, and by consumption I mean mostly books, movies, things like that, but occasionally maybe taking notes, doing light emailing, iMessage, things like that. Like just basic computing. I think you can go for the mini. If you really are going to do something different, and like I work with a lot of text, like if I do long form writing, I tend to do it on the iPad.
Mhm.
So I tried to do it on the mini and it just
Yeah,
wasn't like I just needed a little bit
it's
more.
suboptimal.
Yeah, or for stuff like GarageBand, like yeah, that'll work really great on the Mini. But you for multi-tracking, you might want just a little bit bigger screen, a little bit more real estate, depending on what you plan on doing. I think that's where the decision is made. If you
Yeah.
think I'm just going to do regular stuff, quote unquote, I think the Mini's great, and I think you'll be very happy with it. I think if there's anything where you can see yourself needing or wanting a little extra screen space just for comfort, I think you might want to bump up to the larger one.
Yeah, I'll agree with that completely. If you want power or pixels, you want the iPad 4. If you want portability, you want the iPad mini. So it just depends on what's you can again, there's these three things and you can pick two of them and that's what you're getting. Again, for me, if you're always carrying around a laptop with you, I think the iPad mini might make more sense. If you want to go without a laptop, I think the iPad 4 makes more sense. If you have an original iPad or an iPad 2, um, the iPad mini is an interesting upgrade. It's a good upgrade from the original iPad, but you will be sacrificing screen resolution for the slightly faster, slightly better, but much smaller iPad. If you have an iPad 2, it's a cross grade. You are getting the exact same machine, only smaller. There is no extra powers. So there's no extra power, no extra pixels. It's the same device you had before, only it can fit in the back of your jean pocket if you really needed to.
Yes.
If you have an iPad 3 or iPad 4, there is almost no reason to switch to an iPad mini unless you really don't need that size of a device. You might want it in addition to do different things. If some people have a bigger MacBook at home and a MacBook Air for travel. You might want an iPad for your sofa or for your table and an iPad mini for travel. But then you are not the average user. You are the power Apple user, and you probably bought both of them already.
Yeah. I the thought for me that kind of sums it all up is that I was just telling Amy this earlier. I look at I've never looked at my iPad, my full size iPad, and thought, boy, I wish this thing was smaller. But I
Yeah.
have looked at it and thought, I wish this thing didn't weigh as much as it does. So I think for me, and I guess for people in kind of my bucket where you really do a lot more with it, when the iPad, full size iPad, gets that form factor, the thinner and possibly a little bit lighter, maybe slimming of the battery, like when I get a mini at that size,
Yeah.
that's my optimal device.
I'm going to quickly, we don't have too many questions that we didn't already answer. I tried to answer as many of them as I could on the go. So I'm just going to pick up the edge cases right now. There was one in the chat I didn't address. If you have an iPad 3, is it worth upgrading the iPad 4? The only reason I would say that you could upgrade is the iPad 4 has international LTE and the iPad 3 does not. So if you are living in a place that has phenomenal LTE and you really want to get on that, your iPad 3 doesn't support it. some parts of Europe, Australia, some other places, you might want to try and sell your iPad 3 and get an iPad 4. But otherwise, it is, the camera, front-facing camera is better. The chip is more powerful, but in day-to-day use, it's not something that you'll notice enough to make it worth the money to upgrade.
Yeah, I'm not upgrading mine. I'm keeping my 3 for now.
Sorry, I'm just waiting for the questions to load because. Have we tried various reading apps? This is from Motion Ahmad. Have we tried various reading apps like Goodread or Instapaper? How is the overall reading experience? Marco Armand has said that he is not completely satisfied with Instapaper on the iPad mini, and he would like to detect for the iPad mini and tweak the interface a little bit. I have had no problem with it. I know, Seth, you mentioned that you preferred reading on the bigger one, though.
I do, but actually Instapaper was one of the few apps that I thought looked okay, just because maybe the layout and the way that the fonts sit. I think it's okay. I mean, obviously Marco is a perfectionist
Yes.
to a great degree, and he's spoken at length about that, so I can understand why he looks at it and sees what he doesn't like. But that was one of the apps, that one, and I think Flipboard for me were the two that I looked at and said, yeah, okay, I guess I could get used to this, but all my other stuff kind of outweighed it.
Alan wants to know, he has the camera connection kit from the iPad 2, and he wants to know if it will work on the iPad mini with the Lightning to 30-pin adapter. Apple does not say specifically that that is supported, so I will test that out and I will answer that on the next show. I would like to say yes, but we've been caught often enough with weird compatibility issues that I don't want to give just a snap answer. I have the connection kit here, so I will try that out after the show and get back to you. I think we pretty much answered everything else en passant. Do you have any closing thoughts, Seth, on the iPad mini or the iPad 4?
I think the only closing thoughts I have are I like the device. It's not right for me, and it's not right for me right now. But I like where this is headed. I like the form factor. I like the way it feels. I think if they can extend, that design into the larger iPad line, and really unify the phone and the iPad Mini and the full size iPad, I think it's going to be exceptionally attractive. And I'm really looking forward to having that larger iPad with this, the unibody aluminum look.
DLopes06 wants to know if we think the iPad mini will outsell the full-sized iPad. There are two possibilities for this, and I addressed them both in my review. It could be like the iPod mini, where it did outsell the full-sized iPod because people did value portability over the full-size version. But it could also be like the MacBook Air, where it is not the most popular MacBook, that it is more a niche product for certain people with very specific needs who are willing to step down in power and pixels for the portability that it affords. And it's not clear to me yet where this will fall. A lot of people think that it will outsell the big boy iPad, but I think it's going to take at least a quarter or two before we see a clear pattern.
Yeah, I'm curious to see how that all shakes out, though, because like the iPod Mini, I think this has a lot of legs in terms of the market. I think it's going
Yeah.
to really, really sell a lot of them, both at the price point and just the device in general. I think people are going to go in the store and pick it up and be like, I want to leave with this.
Yeah, I tend towards the iPad Mini being the best-selling iPad, but I've been wrong on that before, so I want to wait and see.
Hmm.
Seth Clifford, sir, thank you very much for your input tonight.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad I was finally able to get back and have power at my house.
Where can we find out more about you?
You can find me on both app.net and Twitter. I am Seth Clifford in both places. You can find me here and on Iterate with Rene and Mark Edwards of Bajango. And if you want to see the work we do, please visit nickelfish.com.
Awesome. And you can find me at Rene Ritchie. You can find all of us at iMore. You can contact us at podcast@imore.com or just leave a message on the show when it goes live on the blog. For all of our shows, check out mobilenations.com/shows. And I want to thank everyone who joined us in the chat room, giving us questions, giving us answers, making us seem smarter than we actually are. You guys are fantastic. And if you have not yet come to the show live, you have not yet seen Shakespeare the way it was meant to be done. So make sure you come next time.